Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on GST audits. Uh, Badri, who is our indirect tax chair, could not join us. I am Arun Ramachandran. I'm co-chair of the Indirect Tax Committee. So I'll be stepping in for Badri. When we were discussing what sort of sessions we should have for indirect taxes, nothing felt more appropriate and much needed than the GST audit experience and the learnings. So it is in this backdrop that we've scheduled about 6 series of webinars on GST audit. These sessions are being handled by renowned professionals practicing in the area of GST. We have senior IAS, IRS officers from GST office who will be speaking to us. And we have renowned industry members as well, which will will do a moderated session with them to understand their experiences of GST audit. With this background, we've invited Mr. Abhay Desai, who is the managing partner of Yagnesh Desai and Company, to address the gathering on do's and don'ts when you get notice or any communication from tax office. A quick introduction: Mr. Abhay Desai is one of the most sought after tax consultant and litigator, and is member of certain indirect tax committees and is a research enthusiast. He's an All India rank holder in a CA examination and also holds a law degree. He's a working partner as a partner at Yagnesh Desai and Company, specializing in the field of GST, and has delivered more than 500 talks on various issues on indirect taxation. And he has also authored multiple articles and he writes and gets published regularly on various journals. We welcome Abhay Desai to BCIC session on GST audit. Uh, we will keep this session interactive, so please feel free to post your queries in the window chat or unmute and please feel free to ask your questions. Over to you, Abhay.
Yeah, good evening, friends. I hope I am audible. So, first,
Yes, you're audible.
yeah, okay. So, I'm grateful to the Bangalore Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to discuss on a very important topic. I believe and I agree with what Mr. Arun just said, that now time has come to really understand what kind of powers department have under the GST law, how those powers can be exercised, because often in the last journey of 4.5 years, we have seen that those powers have not been exercised in a manner in which the law envisages it to be exercised. Often, department, as is the case even before the GST regime, often goes beyond what the law mandates and often results into unwarranted litigation, unwarranted pain, unwarranted, so to speak, harassment of the taxpayers. And hence it's very important for a taxpayer to really understand that what are the powers that the law has given to the department, to the departmental officers, how those powers can be exercised, what are the necessary precautions that a taxpayer must take when he is visited upon either physically by the department by exercising their powers under the provisions related to search, or if the department conducts a routine regular audits, or a department sends certain notices which they have a power to do under the provisions of law. So it is very important for the taxpayer to really understand all those things, and hence I think this session is very apt. I hope my screen should be visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, friends, how I intend to go about is that we have roughly 1 hour or so before I really open this session for the larger Q&A. Of course, during the session, if anyone has any particular issue, I'll not be able to access my chat box since I have loaded the PPT. So feel free. You can unmute yourself and really pitch in and ask any kind of issues that is bothering you related to the given topic, and we'll straight away address that issue so that even not only the person asking the question, but even other participants can get some kind of an idea about what's going to happen in times to come. Now, friends, the topic really is do's and don'ts as a taxpayer that he needs to keep in mind while replying or giving a response to any kind of notices or communication that he may receive from the GST tax office. The way I want to structure this transaction is first to look at the basics as to how the law is framed vis-a-vis the entire process of assessment. Then we go and see what are the powers that the law has given to the department to carry out the verification of the liability which has been self-assessed by a taxpayer and communicated to the government in terms of filing of various forms and returns. We look at the aspect of jurisdiction because many times we have seen that notices are issued by the officers who may not have actual jurisdiction over that particular taxpayer, and still the taxpayers are made to respond to those notices. So we'll look at how the law is framed as far as the jurisdiction are concerned. Then we look at the manner in which the power is to be exercised, the limitations of that power, the remedies that are available to a taxpayer if ultimately a disagreement results to a point where the taxpayer is not ready to agree to the demands of the department and therefore wants to pursue that particular matter further into litigation, what kind of remedies that the taxpayer can have. We look at the demands and recoveries, the overview of those provisions. We look at the aspect where at times when you get the notices would be concerning certain issues which are debatable, which needs to be settled in times to come by the courts, and therefore the taxpayer may consider the option of paying certain liability under protest by reserving the right to litigate, just to limit the exposure, limit the risk of further interest liability. So in that context, what is the law? Then we look at the checklist that when you receive a notice from a department, any notice for that matter concerning GST, what are the important questions that you must ask yourself before preparing the reply? Because going through that checklist will help you to really find out certain flaws in that particular notice, which you can then consider while drafting the reply against those notices. And lastly, we look at the do's and don'ts and certain golden rules that one should keep in mind while responding to the notices. Now, why I have structured this session in this manner is simple, because to respond to a notice, you need to understand the background, you need to understand how the law is framed, because unless you don't know those basics, you will not be able to really respond well. And please mind well that responding to a notice at the first available opportunity by bringing out all the defects that are there in that particular notice will help you certainly a lot when those cases go into litigation, because we have seen, and most of the and some of the participants would agree, we have seen in the past where demands of crores of rupees have been quashed by the courts simply on the ground that the manner in which the entire assessment was carried out was not in accordance with law. So simply on those technical points itself, lots of demands get quashed. A lot of relief is given to the taxpayer when department fails to stick to the law and goes beyond the law at the time of issuing the notices. So that is why a little bit of background is a must to understand how do you respond to those notices. So that is why in the first part we'll look at the background, and in the second part we'll look at the manner in which you can respond to those notices. So friends, this often reminds me, if I have to put my entire session into a single statement, I would say that whenever you receive a notice, don't have that reaction of fighting it or flying away from it, because normally it happens. Like for example, when I was doing my CA course, many times we used to prepare well before the exam, but there was always some tension, some anxiety when we go to the examination hall as to what kind of questions would come. And there is a response or a human tendency to either fight or flight whenever you see something unexpected, or you see something which you did not get a chance to really think through. Similar experience one may have, and that is certain in GST also. When you start getting notices from the department, your first reaction could be either to fight immediately against that notice, or to fly away from that notice by giving a response which may not be a valid response, which may not be a thorough, thought out response, which may just be a response for the sake of it, not really covering all the aspects that normally an ideal response or an ideal reply should cover. So, in a nutshell, don't fight or flight, understand, because I believe once you understand the law regarding the notices and the response that you need to give against those notices, with that understanding, I believe you will have a much more comfort, you will have a much more a sense of peace in really understanding the issues, and that will help you in framing a proper reply. So, in a nutshell, the entire session, the single message that I would convey through this session would be that don't react whenever you get a notice. You respond by understanding the entire background behind the purpose under which that notice has been issued, the legal provisions, what all rights you have against that particular notice. And once you have a thorough understanding of all these facets, then you go ahead and respond in a manner so that eventually you end up avoiding any undue liability, or you avoid any undue further pain. So that is basically the whole objective of this session. So with that, let us start. So friends, GST, as you are aware, is entirely based on the concept of self-assessment. If you see section 59 of the GST Act, it clearly brings out that aspect wherein the onus is first on the taxpayer. The law clearly provides that it is the taxpayer who has to do a self-assessment of his liability, and that self-assessed liability has to be reported in a return that he is supposed to file for every tax period under section 39 of the said act. So that is basically the GSTR 3B that we keep filing on a monthly basis. Now, in a self-assessment system, it is a system wherein a taxpayer declares according to him what is the liability, and then the department verifies that self-assessed liability. And if department finds any kind of short payment or a non-payment of tax, or any erroneous availment of input tax credits, then the department gets the right to proceed to recover that amount following the due process of law. So the entire backbone of GST is self-assessment. In fact, if you see even the definition of suppression that they have introduced, this was never the case in the earlier regime. In the GST regime, in fact, it is for the first time that they have introduced this definition of suppression, which coincides with section 59. In a sense, it says that if something you are supposed to declare in a return or in a statement or in a report that you are supposed to furnish to the department as per the provisions of law, but you don't declare those facts, in that case, that situation would be considered as a case of suppression. Accordingly, if any liability is found that you have not discharged, not only that liability will be recovered, but even the penalty can be imposed on account of the fact that that liability was not discharged due to suppression. So, in a nutshell, in a self-assessed assessment regime, one has to be very careful, since the entire trust is placed on you by law first, that you truthfully come forward and tell the government what is the liability, and accordingly file your returns, and thereafter government gets the opportunity to verify those returns and find out if there is still any tax to be paid. So that is basically the entire backbone of GST law. In fact, recently only the Supreme Court, in fact, one of the first decision on this entire controversy under GST came in the case of Bharti Airtel, where in para 33 of the said decision, Supreme Court in fact reiterated the entire philosophy of self-assessment, which was the case in the pre-GST regime, and borrowed it even under the GST regime. If you see this decision, in fact, I will give you a brief background about this case. This is a company, as you are aware, is engaged in the business of providing telecommunication services. When GST was implemented, they had some issues at their end in terms of not getting the amount of available input tax credit for the first 3 months of the GST when GST was implemented. So they did not claim that input tax credit and they filed the return by paying the entire liability through cash. Subsequently, they became aware about their claim of input tax credit. They wanted to substitute the earlier filed returns wherein they had paid the tax by cash by saying that you consider the credit that was available during that time as a mode through which we have discharged that liability, and accordingly they wanted to revise the return and they wanted to claim the cash refund, the refund of the excess amount of tax that they had paid by cash, which now they wanted to substitute it with credit, which was available at that point in time. The Delhi High Court agreed with this plea of the taxpayer and they allowed the petition by saying that yes, because there was a system was not fully developed and the government has also.
कैसे करके conclude sir? Most पर हम तो फिर cover नहीं रहेगा.
Hello. Yeah. So because of the flaw in the department system, department did not tell me by way of an auto population what is the input tax credit that is available to me, and therefore Delhi High Court says that because of this flaw, this company could not really assess their input tax liability, input tax credits, and therefore they inadvertently paid that amount of tax by cash, which if the department had provided this facility of GSTR 2A, what we call as 2A, wherein you can see the eligible input tax credit based on the filings by your vendors. The Delhi High Court said that if the system, if the government would have provided this 2A right from July 2017, then this company would have not paid the excess liability by cash. They would have certainly utilized the eligible input tax credits. Department was not happy with this judgment, so they took up the matter before the Supreme Court. Supreme Court reversed the Delhi High Court ruling by bringing out at the heart of their argument, saying that in a self-assessment regime, it is the onus of the taxpayer to assess his outward tax liability as well as his input tax credit based on the records that he is supposed to maintain, based on the documents that he is supposed to maintain as per the requirements of law. The portal, that is the GSTN portal, is only a facilitator to communicate the information between the taxpayer and the government vis-a-vis what is the liability that he has self-assessed, vis-a-vis what are the actions that the government intends to take by way of issuing certain notices to the taxpayer. The portal is a facilitator. In a self-assessment regime, basic source would remain documents, which would remain as registers, which would remain as books of accounts, and based on that, this company should have identified their input tax credit based on those records and should not have relied on the portal to tell them as to what is their eligible input tax credit. So Supreme Court says that in a concept of self-assessment, blame cannot be put on the portal. The input tax credit ought to have been derived from the records that that particular taxpayer is supposed to maintain as per law, and therefore they said that Delhi High Court is wrong in saying that because of the fault of the portal, the revision in the returns should be permitted. The Supreme Court did not agree with that logic, saying that revision in return will not be permitted beyond the time limit which is given under Section 39, that is September of the succeeding financial year. So once the time frame is gone, then you cannot revise the return. There is no possibility for revision. So the entire concept of self-assessment again gets reiterated by the Supreme Court, even in the GST regime, by saying that the onus is on the taxpayer first to maintain all the records, self-assess his liability, declare that liability by way of a return, and then the onus shifts on the department to verify those claims, to verify those returns, and based on that verification, if they find that there is any non-payment or short payment, then as per the provisions of law, they can move ahead with the proceedings for making the demand and then recovering those demands. So that in a nutshell again brings out the same concept that already forms part of section 59 of the CGST Act, gets again reiterated by the Supreme Court. So that brings us basically to first understand what are the records that a particular taxpayer is supposed to maintain. Again, I will repeat why I am taking you through all this basic size for you to understand that when you frame your reply against a notice, you need to base your reply based on these provisions, wherein you should have undertaken the self-assessment in a manner prescribed in law, in a sense that you should be maintaining the relevant records, you should be maintaining the relevant documents, and based on that you should have filed the returns, and based on that your reply or response can be given to the notice claiming that you have taken some undue benefit or you have not paid certain undue tax. So this is the background that has to be there in your response whenever you file a reply against the notice. So what are the records that a particular taxpayer is supposed to maintain quickly? There are certain set of documents that a taxpayer is supposed to maintain. I will not take you through all those documents. They are, I think most of the participants are well aware of the same. There are certain typical documents that I believe one must maintain, which practically we see on at the ground level, many taxpayers are not yet maintaining. One example could be an invoice under the reverse charge mechanism. As you are aware, whenever you discharge tax under a reverse charge mechanism, if the supplier is an unregistered vendor, let us say is an advocate, an unregistered advocate, or an unregistered goods transport agency, in all those situations, the requirement of making an invoice is shifted to the recipient who is discharging the tax under reverse charge mechanism, and that particular invoice is considered as a valid document for the purpose of availing the input tax credit. So this is again one document that one is supposed to prepare regularly and maintain as part of the claim of input tax credit that he is making in his self-assessed return. Similarly, there are requirements of maintaining e-way bill related records because the government has now started the process of reconciling the data that is available to them through the e-way bill portal with the data that is available to them through the returns that are filed by the taxpayer. Government is already in the process of reconciling, sending the notices asking for the reasons for the deviations between those two figures. Certainly, there are valid reasons for the deviation because the returns capture all the transactions which are in the nature of supply, either of goods or services. E-way bill records are basically meant for transportation of goods. So certainly there will be a variation, but that needs to be justified, and that is what the department is also looking at whenever they find a variation between those two figures. So basically, these are the documents that one is supposed to maintain. There are certain other requirements as to what the manner of the making of those documents. I am not going to take you through all of that. You can see the relevant sections and the rules to really understand what these documents should contain. But the point I am making is all these documents should be available with you to as a part of the entire self-assessment process to justify the finding, the figures that you filed in the returns. As far as the records are concerned, Section 35 makes it very clear what are the records that you are supposed to maintain. Over and above Section 35, we have certain rules, more particularly Rule 56, wherein certain set of records have been stipulated that a particular taxpayer is required to maintain. Those records start right from basic records, right, maintaining the registers for all the supplies that you have done, maintaining the addresses, the names of all the suppliers, all your customers, maintaining the production data, the production related records in terms of quantitative data of how much material you have used in the process of manufacture, what are the scrap waste
Hello?
that gets generated
Yes,
out
sir.
of that process.
Yes,
If
sir.
you are in a works contract, then certain
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No issue.
hello.
At
Yeah. So if you are a works contractor, then you need to maintain certain additional records in terms of the separate accounts for each contract that you are entering into and executing for your customers. So similarly, there are other records that one is supposed to maintain as per Rule 56. Again, this is something that you must consider as part of the self-assessment process, because again, this will help you in justifying the claims that you have made in the returns, which are now getting questioned by the notices that is given by the department. Certainly, the records can be maintained in electronic form. The only requirement is that those records, if you are maintaining in an electronic form, all the taxpayers are maintaining records in an electronic form. So those records are to be authenticated by way of a digital signature. Again, that is a requirement which is flowing from law. If in the records you are undertaking any you are erasing something, effacing or overwriting something, or if you are putting some incorrect entries, then the law mandates that a detailed electronic log of all the entries which are edited or deleted is also required to be maintained. Law also provides for maintaining electronic backup of the records. This is in a case where your main file gets either corrupted or so that is again a mandate flowing from law. Then there is a special requirement for those businesses who are basically in the business of running warehouses, godowns, storing the goods, or engage in transportation business. There's an additional requirement for maintaining certain records vis-a-vis the goods that you are storing in such places. As far as the time limits are concerned, the law mandates that the books of accounts and all the records have to be maintained for 72 months, that is 6 years, from the due date of furnishing of the annual return. So, for example, if we talk about financial year 2021, as you are aware, the due date of furnishing the annual return has been extended to 20th of February 2022. So 6 years from that, so that will be 2028. So for 2021 records, you need to maintain those records till 28th of February 2028. Of course, there is an exception that if for, let us say, 2021 itself, let us take a case, if there are any disputes related to that time period, and you are into appeal, or department is into appeal, or any other proceedings related to that time period are open, then you need to continue maintaining records for that period even beyond this period of 6 years, and you need to retain that once your case gets concluded. Despite that, even for further period of 1 year from the final disposal, you need to still maintain those records, and only thereafter you can dispose of those records. So again, this is a requirement which is flowing from the Act. Now, when you self-assess your liability, you look at your documents, you look at your records. Based on that, you compile the necessary information using your system, whatever software you are using. Once you pull out those figures, these are the illustrative list of filings that you do on a periodical basis. Some filings you do it on monthly basis, like GSTR1, a statement of outward supplies, you file it on a monthly basis. Then there is a return, GSTR3B, again you do it on a monthly basis. Then there are certain returns like annual return that you do it once in an annual year. And then there are certain other forms like ITC 01, 02, which are on a case-to-case basis. You file based on if you are covered by those situations. So in a nutshell, when we talk about self-assessment, these are the precursors for a self-assessment. Once you have done your thorough homework, once all this basis is available with you, then it is the department's turn to send you a notice to verify all those claims that you are making through all the filings that you are doing, and then the process of recovery and demands will start. And why this understanding was needed was that once now department steps in, if you have done your homework thoroughly, you will have a solid footing in terms of responding in a very well manner against those notices. So please keep this entire concept in mind. This is very important because, as time will tell, department, now we are moving into a regime where lot of notices are getting issued just based on comparison of data from one source with other source. For example, your GSTR 2A amount, the amount of input tax credit that is reflected in your GSTR 2A is, is compared with what you claim in 3B, and based on that notices are getting issued. Similarly, comparisons are done between 1 versus 3B. Comparisons are done between your job work, your e-way bill data with GSTR 1 and 3B. Comparisons are also being done between your e-invoicing data and your GSTR 1 data or GSTR 3B data. So in a regime where we are slowly moving into a situation where the government is going to carry out multifold comparisons across the databases that they are getting, maybe within the ambit of GST, maybe even outside the ambit of GST. For example, they are going to reconcile your imports made, which is reflected in your customs database under the IceGate ambit, with the amount of input tax credit that you are claiming under the filings that you do within the GST ambit. Similarly, your exports also can get compared. Time will also come where the data from RBI will also be cross-linked as regards the foreign remittances that you are getting vis-a-vis the claim of exports that you are making, either of goods or of services. So in that regime, whenever notices are going to come based on those comparisons, you need to be thoroughly prepared by saying first and foremost that based on law, you are supposed to undertake a self-assessment. You have undertaken that by maintaining the records which you are otherwise required to maintain. You annex all those copies of whatever relevant records are there for that particular, against that particular notice, and make a claim that based on that, what you have done is right. Now let department tell you, based on scrutiny of those records, where your claim is wrong. With this approach, let me tell you, you will save unwarranted litigations. If you don't go in this manner, if you just simply say that your figures are wrong, my figures are right, and you stop there, nothing will happen. Department will will still go ahead, issue the notice, matter will drag into litigations, and it will just waste everyone's time. So if you go on the basis of the concept of self-assessment as what is there in the law, and based on that, if you frame your reply, you will have an exceedingly high chance in saying to the courts when if the matters travel at that stage, that whatever was expected from you by law, you have done. Based on that, you have given whatever is expected by law to the officer. Officer simply disregarded those facts, and he held on to whatever figures that were made available to him through at his end, and went ahead and raised the demand. With that approach, certainly those actions will fail if you have done your homework and if you have justified that in terms of filing a proper response to those notices. So this brings us to that concept of burden of proof. It is settled in law that if you have done a self-assessment, if you are maintaining the records as what we discussed a short while ago, then the burden is on the department to say that why still some liability is unpaid or why still some liability is short paid. Only where you are claiming certain exemptions in law, for example, there are exemptions in GST law that are available where certain supplies are exempt from tax, or there are certain conditional exemptions. In such situation, the burden still remains on you, because in a return, you cannot communicate whether you have fulfilled all those conditions. So in that case, the burden still remains on you. Tomorrow, the government can ask you as a proof of compliance with all those conditions. In that context, you are supposed to comply and give them the valid proof about the conditions that you have fulfilled. Except that on the outward side, except the exemptions, if the government wants to recover any liability from you, if you are maintaining the records as what is expected from you, then clearly the burden is on the department, the burden is on the government to tell specifically that this is the income, this is the receipt, and on this basis we are saying that tax is payable, and then the onus will be on you to defend your claim as to why tax is not payable by you on that particular receipt or on that particular income. So as far as the burden of proof is concerned on the outward side, this again has to come out in your response, saying that you have discharged your burden, whatever was expected from you, and now department cannot just blindly pick up a difference in a two figure and ask you to pay that money to the government. The burden is on them to really show where that particular income lies, why it is taxable, what is the nature of supply, what is the applicable tax rate, and only if they satisfy this test, then only the recovery is possible. On the input tax side, the situation is slightly different. The law itself mandates under section 155 that the burden remains on the taxpayer as far as the claiming of input tax credit is concerned. So when you claim an input tax credit, the burden is on you. Once you satisfy that burden, then the onus is on the department to say why that particular input tax credit was not eligible or was restricted in law. So again, this is something which one must keep in mind while responding to a notice. It should not happen that an unreasonable burden is casted on you by a particular notice, which anyway you cannot fulfill, but the department compels you to fulfill. In those situations, you can bring this aspect out in your response by saying that this is what was expected from me by law. This is how I have fulfilled that expectation. Beyond that, nothing was expected from me. And therefore, if beyond that, if something is asked, and on non-provision of that, those facts, if the department presumes that there is a liability, that entire presumption would be wrong. That entire presumption would not sustain in the courts when those matters will go. So, in a nutshell, please keep these basics in mind while drafting a reply against the notice. Now, let us say you have done your homework, you have filed the returns. Now the ball is in the department's court. Now the law has given them the powers to verify those claims. So powers range from section 60 of the CGST Act and it goes up to section 72 of the CGST. Let us see in a nutshell what are those powers that the government can exercise, and because the notices that you will receive or would have received would be concerning these provisions itself. So that is why it is must to understand these sections before really getting into the drafting of the response against those notices. So section 60 talks about provisional assessment. This is not much practical because this applies in a situation where as a taxpayer you are not able to determine your value of supply or the tax rate. Then you approach the government, you approach the officer and ask them to determine for you what is the value and what is the tax rate. Certainly this is something which no prudent taxpayer would do. A prudent taxpayer would on his own determine what is the value and what is the tax rate, because if you go to the department, if you go to the government, they will pick up obviously the figures that will be that will be in their interest, certainly not in the interest of the taxpayers. So that is why this section, although in law, although it is there in law, but not that practical. This is very important. Section 61. This is where many of you would have seen, would have received notices or would be receiving notices based on the returns that you are filing. Once you file your return, the government has given this power under section 61 to the officers to scrutinize those returns, and if during the process of scrutiny, if they notice any discrepancy, then the officer can inform the discrepancy to the taxpayer. That is in the form what we call it as ASMT 10. Based on that discrepancy, a taxpayer is supposed to respond to that discrepancy. This is the power that is often exercised in notices that are issued based on comparison between GS input tax credit based on 2A versus 3B, or on the outward side based on comparison between 1 versus 3B. There are certain other parameters also that are used by the department under the for purpose of identifying the discrepancy, and based on that the notices are issued under this provision. Once you furnish the reply, you get 30 days time to furnish the reply. Once you furnish the reply, if that reply is acceptable to that officer, then the proceedings will culminate. If the reply is not acceptable to that officer, then please understand this is very vital. This is something which I often find that it is lacking, is the fact that if, let us say, you have filed the reply against the notice that you have received under section 61 and that reply is not acceptable to that officer, that would not mean that tomorrow officer will come to recover those dues, whatever amount that he has stated in that notice. That is clearly not envisaged in law. What the law provides under section 61 is that if that officer is not happy with your reply, if he is not satisfied with your reply, then he can either initiate an audit, a regular audit under section 65. He can either initiate a special audit under section 66. He can also initiate a search or maybe inspection under section 67, or he can, if let us say he does not want any additional information through the power of audit or search, he wants to straight away go and raise the demand. Still then he can do that only if he has issued a show cause notice under section 73 or 74. Once you get a show cause notice, another opportunity will be given to you to present your case, to represent your case before that particular adjudicating authority as to why the demands based on mentioned in that show cause notice are not tenable. And after considering all your response, then an order will be passed under section 73 or 74. That order again is not straight away, that liability under that order straight away again cannot be recovered. If you are going into appeal, certainly you get a stay when you deposit the mandatory pre-deposit. Only when you don't challenge that order further and you accept that liability and still you don't pay, it is only in that situation that the recovery proceedings can be initiated. So merely when you receive a notice in ASMT 10 and if you file a response against that notice in ASMT 11, at that stage it would not mean that if the officer is not satisfied with that response, the liability straight away will accrue on you. Answer is no. The liability will accrue only if the officer has to issue a show cause notice, which is a separate notice. ASMT 10 is not the show cause notice. And based on that, an adjudication proceeding has to be conducted. And post that adjudication, based on that final adjudication order, then the further proceedings, either by way of you accepting the demand or litigating those demands by way of going into an appellate process. Based on that, the proceedings of recovery can be initiated. Straight away, no recovery is possible. Just on the fact that officer is not satisfied with the reply that you have filed against the notice that you have received under section 61. This is a very important fact. You should keep this in mind while drafting the reply to those notices, because majority of the notices that based on written scrutiny that have been issued, all of those notices have been issued under section 61 that we discussed. Now 62 talks about assessment of non-filers. So these are the taxpayers who are registered in GST law but they are not filing the returns. So for that a separate mechanism has been carved out to assess those taxpayers. It is again based on the principle of base judgment assessment. Whatever material is available to that officer, the officer will use to carry out the assessment. 63 applies in the case of unregistered person. So a person is unregistered, and still department thinks that that person is liable to GST. In that situation, section 63 will be invoked to carry out the assessment. 64 talks about summary assessment. These are in very special cases where the department apprehends that till it takes time to issue the show cause notice, adjudicate the demand and then recover the amount. If department based on cogent evidence is of the view that during this process the taxpayer may abscond, in those situations based on special permission from the additional or joint commissioner, the department can carry out a summary assessment. Again, those summary assessment needs to be set aside if eventually the commissioner is of the view that a proper procedure which is already there in terms of undertaking adjudication under 73 or 74, that is required to be followed. Then 65 is departmental audits. This is something that has already started for financial year 17, 18, 18, 19. At many places, the department has already started their audits. What important aspects to consider here is that without notice, no audit can start. Please understand well. For initiating the departmental audit, there is a requirement, a mandatory requirement of giving a notice in a form called as ADT 01. If you have not received that form, if you have simply received a covering letter saying that we want to conduct the audit and we want this information, that is not the valid notice under section 65 for you to straight away start complying with those requirements. Second, any notice that you receive for audit in form ADT01, the department is mandated to give 15 days prior intimation before initiating the audit. So it is not a case where they give the audit notice and ask you that within 3 days or 5 days or 10 days you submit the information. The law mandates a minimum period of 15 days to be kept before initiating the audit. One more important aspect, once you receive the notice for audit, let us say in ADT01, and once you file a response against that notice by complying and submitting all the requisite data, please keep an acknowledgement of that submission. Why? The law has mandated that audit has to be completed within 3 months from the date of commencement. Only in special cases, the period of 3 months can be extended to 6 months, but even in those cases, the officer has to record the reasons, taking the permission from their superior as to why that officer could not complete the audit within this statutory period of 3 months. This is again very important, because if the entire process turns out to be an invalid exercise because the audit was never conducted in the manner in which it has been envisaged, certainly the technical point will help you in responding to the notices that you eventually may be served upon under section 73 or 74, that is the show cause notices. Again, very important. In fact, this was in the excise era. This was not part of law. It was part of a excise manual. And now it is part of law itself. That once the audit is concluded, all the findings of that audit, as well as the rights and obligations of that person, has to be informed to the taxpayer. This is very important, friends, because once an audit is concluded, unless you are not informed about the observations that have been noticed by the department in respect of that particular audit, you will never get a chance to really exercise that option which is given under section 73 or 74 in terms of agreeing to that demand and avoiding the penal consequences, avoiding further penalty. So it is in that context that it is very important that observations have to be communicated. There is again another advantage of this also, because once the audit observations are communicated, those observations itself will be the basis for the show cause notice that will be issued subsequently if you are not going to agree to those demands. Now, if there is a huge deviation between the allegation that was put to you in the audit report vis-a-vis the show cause notice, again that will give you a point to contest, saying that the show cause notices is taking a stand which is contradicting the stand that was taken in the audit report. So many factual aspects, if they are misrepresented in the show cause notice, they can be argued based on the audit report, the copy of the audit report that will be made available to you immediately on the conclusion of that audit. So that is why once the audit is concluded, please take the audit report. Don't forget taking that audit report. This will also help you in a sense that tomorrow some other authority comes for audit for the same tax period. Let us say you are with the central department and state jurisdiction comes for audit, or vice versa. Again, the copy of that audit report will help you in avoiding the repetitive verification of your records. This will again help you in cases where, let us say, in the first audit, if certain points are not detected by the department, but records were made available by you to the department. In the subsequent audit, if on those points, if certain demands are sought to be raised, department cannot have the extended period to raise those demands, because already this information was known to them during their first audit, but it was never objected in their audit report. So in the second audit report, they cannot certainly raise a new objection saying that this is an information which was suppressed by the taxpayer, which permits them to invoke the extended period of limitation for raising the demands, which is a 5-year period vis-a-vis the normal period of 3 years, and also permits the department or allows the department to impose penalty. So it is in that context that taking a copy of audit report is a must after the conclusion of that audit. Here also again, once the audit is concluded, simply direct recovery is not possible. Department still will have to follow the adjudication process under section 73 or 74 as the case may be, and only after that adjudication any recovery is possible. 66 is special audit. This is again in exceptional cases where the department can appoint external agencies like a chartered accountant or a cost accountant to carry out the special audit.
If you can,
67 talks about,
sorry, if we can
yeah,
pause for a moment, there are a couple of questions in the chat window, and I see Ashish Ghoshala's question. He's raised his hand.
okay, sure.
We could probably take a couple of questions here, if you
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
mind.
sure, sure. Yeah, sure, sure.
Ashish, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Abhay,
Yeah,
this side Ashish Ghoshal, I'm locating at Kolkata.
okay,
My first question is that when we are receiving audit notice, there's the two types of audit notice we are receiving. First notice is from the directly GST department. Another is the from the sales tax department or the department. This is the two audit
right,
notice. First point, what you say that within uh, after submission of the audit, all the communication, all the document, they supposed to complete the audit proceeding within 3 months. Correct?
right.
Oh, as per my understanding, after submission all these document within 45 days they supposed to show us their observation or any so cause, and after that we supposed to give a reply, and based on that entire cycle should be completed within 3 months. Am I correctly understood, sir?
No. See, the process is like this, that audit has to be completed within 3 months. After the 3 month window is over, the
Hmm.
department is supposed to give you an audit report listing out their findings, their observations, and
Hmm.
asking you to comply with those observations. Let us suppose you don't agree with those observations, then they will initiate the proceedings under section 73 or 74 in terms of giving you a show cause notice. Then an adjudication will happen, and thereafter the demand order would get issued. So that is how the process will work. So 3 months period is only for completing the audit, not for issuing the show cause notice or adjudicating the show cause notice. For that, there is a separate time frame given under section 73, which what we discussed is 3 years, and
Correct.
section 74, which is 5 years.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
The couple of questions in the chat window, I'll just read it out. There's a question from Mr. M.V. Nagesh on table 8A of GSTR 9. The burden of proof of details coming in table 8A in the notice is with the department or with the assessee.
Yeah, certainly. So as far as 8A is concerned, basically the table 8A captures the auto-populated figure of the input tax credit based on the departmental's GSTN portal. And that figure is compared with the input tax credit that you have availed in your returns, and a difference is worked out. Based on that, the notices are getting issued. Now, certainly the information that is auto-populated in 8A is not made available to the taxpayer, neither at the time of auto drafting GSTR 9, nor in the notices that are given by the department based on this comparison. So clearly, if the department is asking you to justify the difference without giving any factual basis of the figures that they have picked up from their portal, certainly the burden does not shift to you, burden remains. Your burden is only what we discussed under section 150, to tell to the department that as per law you are supposed to maintain the register of input tax credit. This is the register that you have maintained. These are the transactions on which you are eligible for the credit, and accordingly you avail the credit. If you have discharged that, then the onus will be on the department to come back and tell you that why still certain amount of credit still according to their opinion is not eligible or is restricted. So that is how the process will work.
Okay, so the other question is on section 61, whether the jurisdictional officer can alone issue notice or any other departmental officer can assume jurisdiction and issue notice under section
No.
61.
Yeah. So on the jurisdiction, I'm coming to that aspect separately. So if the querist can wait for that, just maybe in 7 minutes, we'll reach that point. I'll discuss at length the entire issue of jurisdiction. I believe at that stage, the query will get resolved. If not, then certainly the querist can again come back with any additional issue.
Sure. Then we'll take this up. I also see Mr. Manjesh's hand raised. Do you want to
Yeah,
do
yeah,
you
yeah.
have any other question, Mr. Manjesh?
Hi, Abhay.
Yeah.
Thanks for this session. Just one query on Section 65 audit. Now, when Section 65 audit is, suppose there is an audit which is supposed to be issued by because we are registered under the state jurisdiction. Now,
Okay.
my first question is, can the central jurisdiction authority can take up an audit?
No, no. They cannot take up Section 65 audit, certainly.
So it's only the jurisdictional officer who can take up an audit.
Yeah. Yeah. So once we go on the jurisdiction slide, I will tell you why I'm saying so.
Okay. Second follow-up question on this is that the can this audit notice be issued for IS registration?
See, ISD
Unfortunately for
registration,
us,
it's a
yeah,
settled law now that ISD is merely an office which is passing and distributing the credit. Whatever demands that the department might have as regards any ineligible credit that have been distributed, it is to be made at the end of the receiving unit who have actually availed those credits. So ISD cannot be subjected to audit, because certainly even after audit there is no demand that legally can sustain against the ISD. The demands, if at all, has to be raised against that particular end recipient of that legal entity.
okay. Okay. Thanks, Abhay. Because today we have received one notice from the authority for IS registration. So that's the
You
reason
can
why I
quote,
just
lot of
wanted to.
precedents are there in the excise law, because the GST has borrowed their entire ISD concept from the excise law. Lot of precedents are
Yeah.
there where consistently the courts have taken a view that there is no liability on ISD per se. The liability is only at the end of the final receiving unit, either it's a manufacturing location or a service location, where those credit have eventually been consumed and utilized in discharging their output tax. It is at that end that any demand, if at all, are to be raised, not at the end of the ISD.
At the end of this session, can you just share some of the
Yeah, yeah, certainly. You can
so,
just share your email ID. I'll certainly send across those compilation of those decisions.
thanks, Abhay. Thanks, Arun.
So, continuing with the presentation. So, section 68 basically is for e-way bill. We'll skip this, not that much relevant. But this is again a power that department has for issuing notices if they find any violations in the documentation which is there during the movement of goods. Then this is a power to arrest. This is something which is again with the department. They often use that power after the onset of GST in cases involving fake billing or bogus billings. They have a power to arrest. Again, these matters are right now sub judice. They are before the Supreme Court. How far those powers, exercise of those power is valid in a situation where department is yet to assess the liability, and before assessing the liability of that particular person, the department is arresting those person. How far that is possible, the cases are right now pending in the Supreme Court on that particular aspect. But certainly CRPC will apply here, and when you apply CRPC here, CRPC grants certain protections to a person who is arrested or about to be arrested. So there is a provision for seeking a anticipatory bail or bail. So based on that, you can, based on case to case basis, you can address that situation. And section 70 is a general power to summon any person for giving any kind of statement or evidence. Again, this is important because this is used during the further proceedings by the department. So that is again here, it's important that if, let us say, certain statement is recorded under coercion, under threat, you are well within your rights to immediately file a rebuttal, to immediately retract from that statement by giving the necessary evidence, to bring out the actual facts before that particular officer, so that the statement that was taken under coercion or under threat is not binding on you when those proceedings are eventually taken up by way of issuance of show cause. 71 is a general power to access business premises. This is a lighter power as compared to search. but often this power gets clubbed with search power under section 67, what we saw earlier when the department visits the premises of a taxpayer. And this is a residual power where for GST officers, they can seek the help from police or officers from other departments in undertaking their functions under the GST law. So once we have this bird's eye view of what the department can do, because the notices that you will receive in GST would all be around whatever provision that we have discussed, because there are no other provisions which permits the department to issue any notice. These are the provisions that we saw. These are in a nutshell the provisions under which the notices will be issued. Why we discuss that provisions? Again, to help you become aware that if those notices travel beyond what is mandated in law, certainly when you file a response, that objection has to be raised. Now coming to the aspect of jurisdiction, when we look at jurisdiction, we have to look at it from a three vantage point. One is a functional jurisdiction. Now, if you see the law at many places is using the term proper officer, where it says the proper officer has a power to issue notice, a proper officer has a power to adjudicate, a proper officer has a power to recover. So the term proper officer has been used. But it is not the case where every officer of the department is a proper officer. If you see circular number 3, it's a board circular where internally they have determined that powers under a particular section can be used by the officer of which rank. So as an example, if under section 65, through this circular, the board has said that the power to issue notice for ADT 1 can be issued by an officer who is of the rank of a superintendent or of a higher rank, then if you get an ADT 1 notice issued by an officer who is a rank of, let us say, an inspector, which is below the rank of superintendent, in that case, that particular notice is an invalid notice because it is lacking the functional jurisdiction which otherwise that notice ought to have. So first element that you have to see whenever you get any notice before drafting the reply is whether the officer who has issued that notice, whether that officer has been vested with that authority to perform that function under the law. If that officer has not been vested with that authority, certainly that officer is not empowered to issue those notices. Second is the territorial jurisdiction. Now, notification 2/2017 has demarcated various territories and identified the commissionerates and the commissioners who are going to administer the taxpayers located within that territory. So again, here, whenever you get a notice, you have to see whether the jurisdiction from where you are getting a notice, whether it has a territorial jurisdiction over you. If that office, if that tax office does not have a territorial jurisdiction over you, again that point has to be brought out in your response, because again on that basis that notice will not be a valid notice. And the third is the center and state controversy. Now, legally speaking, the law as on date, neither the State Act nor the Center Act clearly says that if the taxpayer is with the State Department, Center will not interfere, or vice versa. The law is silent on that aspect. However, the law clearly speaks about one thing, wherein says that when there is an intelligence-based enforcement action which is taken, it will have a concurrent jurisdiction, and the law says that once a particular issue is picked up by, let us say, Center, then even if you are with the state cannot raise or cannot initiate proceedings on that very issue simultaneously. So that protection is there in law, wherein the law says that if one issue has been picked up by either of the authority, either state or center, then the other authority cannot then step in on that particular issue and initiate again concurrent proceedings for the same issue. Now that provision clearly signifies the one aspect, and that is this, that the lawmakers were conscious when they said that if based on a one issue, if one if one wing, if the center steps in, state cannot step in and vice versa, it clearly means that the intention is not to have dual jurisdiction over that same taxpayer. That fact also comes out from the 9th council meeting. If you see the 9th GST council meeting minutes, they are available on the GST council website. It clearly uses the language that we are dividing the taxpayers between center and state for all administrative purposes, only based on intelligence-based enforcement action, it will have a concurrent jurisdiction, but again with the caveat that once one department steps in, the other department cannot step in on that very issue. So what I am holding a view is this, that since the council meeting is the apex body which is having a constitutional status, it is formed under the powers of under the constitution which was amended to bring in the GST. Since it's a constitutional body and a recorded minutes of the meeting of the constitutional body says that for all administrative purposes we are dividing the taxpayers, and there are open leaflets, open flyers given by the department saying that we want to avoid dual jurisdiction, it clearly signifies one thing, that except the enforcement action, all other routine actions, be it the audit under section 65 or notices under section 61 based on written scrutiny, all those actions cannot have concurrent jurisdiction. It will only that authority will have a jurisdiction under which that taxpayer has been demarcated. So if a particular taxpayer has been put under center jurisdiction, only center will have the jurisdiction to carry out the audit or to issue the notice under section 61. If you find otherwise, certainly you can raise the objection by referring to these minutes of the council meeting, by referring to the provisions of law, more specifically section 6, which clearly brings out this aspect, and you can certainly object to that, saying that since you are with the state, now center cannot have assumed jurisdiction for a routine matter. Only when there is a case of enforcement based, intelligence based action, only in that case there can have a concurrent jurisdiction. That is in the case of search, which we discussed under section 67. Only in cases of search under section 67, one may consider that concurrent jurisdiction will be a valid jurisdiction. But again, there is a caveat that once one authority steps in, the second authority cannot step in. So you have to look at the jurisdiction from all these three vantage points. And if you find that the notice lacks any of the three or all the three, certainly you, in your response, that fact, that ground has to go that these notices are not valid. This is again, I'm saying, important because the law presumes that if you don't object to those jurisdiction at the first stage, if you let us say cooperate with those notices which are otherwise lacking jurisdiction, if you don't raise an objection in your reply, and let us say at the appellate stage, then you raise the reply saying that these entire proceedings are invalid because the officer did not have the jurisdiction itself, either functional, territorial or center state. At that stage, it will be futile because the law provides that if you are going to challenge the jurisdiction of a notice, the challenge has to be made on day one itself. You cannot wait for the challenge to be made at the appellate stage. So please understand this point very well, that objection has to be raised on day one itself when you file a response against the notice if you are challenging the jurisdiction. All other grounds, legal grounds, you can even add at the appellate stage. But jurisdiction ground, you cannot add it at the appellate stage. You have to add it at the first available opportunity when you want to file a response against that notice. So this is something which is very important. We have seen so many cases where wrong jurisdictions have been invoked, and we have objected to those jurisdictions. And certainly when those cases will travel, this objection itself will be very beneficial to that particular taxpayer in getting those entire proceedings quashed. So this is something that I believe participants must keep in mind. How do you exercise the power? Now, it is not the case where department can send notices in any form. GST law is unique in that sense. It is different from excise or service tax. GST law mandates that for every proceeding that department wants to initiate, there is a specific form and a specific manner in which that has to be initiated. For example, if they want to do a written scrutiny and after that they want to communicate any deficiencies, there is a specific form ASMT 10. There is a specific manner in which that form has to be communicated to the taxpayer. If, let us say, department fails in doing that, if they neither issue the prescribed form or neither they serve the notice in a prescribed manner, certainly that is again a defective notice. Recently, we had a case in Madhya Pradesh High Court where the show cause notice under section 73 is supposed to be issued in a form which is called as DRC 01, and that show cause notice, that summary of that show cause notice in form DRC 01 has to be electronically served on the taxpayer. That is the language used in Rule 142. Now, this was a case where the department emailed that particular form to the taxpayer. Straight away that action was challenged in the High Court. High Court said that when the law mandates a particular activity or a particular act to be done in a particular manner, if that manner is not followed, then that will not be a valid act. And the High Court quashed the entire proceedings simply on this ground that the summary of show cause notice in form DRC-01 was not electronically served on the portal, because the electronically serving of the notice is through portal. Through email is not considered as an electronically serving of the notice when you see the meaning of the term electronic serving of the notice under the GST law. So it is in that context that it is very important to have this also in mind while drafting the reply. The powers that are exercised by the officer have some inherent limitations. What we saw under section 61, it is based on scrutiny of returns. Now, if they are traveling beyond returns, and under section 61, if they are asking you to produce any additional documents on some additional issue, not related to returns at all, not related to what you have submitted in the returns, again that is again traveling beyond what is permissible in law. So this is something again one has to keep in mind. Why I am discussing all this again, I will repeat, is that when you file a response, unless you don't have this knowledge of jurisdiction, manner of issuing the notice, manner of serving the notice, limitations of the power, you will not be able to draft the response. You may be right on the merits, on the factual aspect, you may clarify to the officer whatever issue is involved, but don't forget taking the legal issues also along with the factual aspects. Now let us say there is a disagreement. The law provides straight away you cannot recover. You need to still serve the show cause notice, complete the adjudication, and only thereafter remedy recovery is possible. Of course, you have an option that once those notices are issued, you have given the response, officer is not satisfied with the response and still telling you to pay the demand. Normally, you should not approach the High Court straight away. You should ask the officer that if you are not satisfied, the law mandates that you have to still issue a show cause notice under 73 or 74 and carry out the adjudication. If the officer is still of the mood of harassing you by saying that no, straight away we'll recover the money since we are not satisfied with your reply. If this kind of language is there in their communication, the only remedy would be to straight away challenge it in a writ court. You have to go to the High Court. You have to bring this fact across to the High Court, saying that no recovery is possible based on simple notices that we discussed under section 61. It has to be followed up with a show cause notice, adjudication of that notice, and only thereafter, if any confirmed liability is there and the taxpayer is not going into appeal, only in that situation recovery is possible. Before that stage, recovery is not possible. So where some fundamental rights are violated, you can go to the writ court. Where demands are made without adjudication, you can go to the writ court. Or where there is an unreasonable exercise of the power to cause harassment, again that is again a situation where you can go to the writ court rather than going through the normal channel of getting the show cause notice and then agitating that show cause notice. As far as demands and recoveries are there, again the law provides stringent conditions that are to be satisfied by the officers based on what power they want to exercise. So as you can see on your screen, it ranges from 73, which is to demand taxes in cases not involving fraud, 74 cases that involve fraud or any willful misstatement or suppression. Then there is a provision which governs general principles for determination of tax, section 75. Then recovery proceedings are there, and then there is a section for provisional attachment. I think we can skip this because this is something again you must keep in mind. I'll share the presentation. This is for the reason that if you receive a notice, let us say it's a show cause notice, alleging suppression, alleging willful misstatement, alleging fraud, then these are the landmark cases that where they have distilled very important principles. First and foremost, not declaring something which you are not required to declare is not suppression. Second, a stand taken in law based on a conscious application of law, it may not be accepted to that officer. Again, that is not the situation of suppression. A bona fide view of a particular transaction, and based on that, GST view is taken, again that is not suppression or that is not fraud. So these are some time tested principles which have been upheld time and again by the courts. These are some illustrative judgments. These are to be again kept in mind while responding to the notices if those notices are alleging such kind of situations. When you get a show cause notice, these are again some principles that have to be kept in mind while replying to a show cause notice, because that is a foundation. If any charge is on you, a show cause notice has to be very clear as to what is the charge. If the show cause notice is not clear as to what is the charge, if show cause notice does not mention the grounds on which they want to demand anything from you, such vague show cause notices cannot be or will not sustain. So again, this is something that you have to keep in mind. When you get a show cause notice which is vague, which is not clearly laying out what are the charges, which is not clearly saying under which section you have violated a particular section or a particular rule, and based on that, why that amount should not be recovered. If that kind of categorical findings are not there, if the notices are based on presumptions, assumptions, those notices are not valid. You have to challenge those facts. You have to challenge those grounds when you file a reply against that show cause. This is a scheme, this is a kind of an amnesty scheme, so to speak, you can say in law, where it says that if the case is of 73 and if you accept payment of tax and interest before show cause notice, then the case will close. There will be no penalty on you. Similarly, if we let us say, if you have a case of 74, then the case can be concluded if you agree to pay the tax, interest and penalty, which is equivalent to 15% of the tax amount. So similarly, this is the first stage where you can get your proceedings closed if you agree to make the payments based on the table that you can see on your screen. Even after issuance of show cause notice, you get still 30 days time to close the case, but the amount of penalty that you have to pay increases from 15% to 25% under 74. If, let us say, even after getting the order, still if you don't want to get into litigation and want to close the proceeding, again third opportunity is given, but here the penalty amount will be still higher. To close the case, now you will have to pay 50% of the tax as penalty as opposed to 15% that otherwise you could have paid before the show cause notice to close the case. Now, why I am discussing all this aspect, that as I told earlier, every notice is not an opportunity to fight. You have to evaluate your facts. If your facts are such that really there is some mistake that you have committed, really there is something where clearly the law is against you, then it is wise to consider these options that are available to you instead of challenging those notices, because ultimately if you lose, you will expose yourself to a much larger interest, a much larger penalty as compared to the option that is presently available to close the proceeding. So, but again, this has to be evaluated on a case-to-case basis. There cannot be any general law or a general guidance on that. For every case, you need to see whether your case, how strong your merits are, how strong you are on technical points, and based on that, a call has to be taken. Provisional attachment, again, this is something which recently only the law has been amended. A wider power has been given to the authorities to provisionally attach your assets. But again, recently only we have a very good decision of Supreme Court in the case of Radhakishan Industries, where they have said that the powers of provisional attachment cannot be abused. They have to be used only based on a cogent evidence. So again, this is something that ratio will still apply even after the amendment that comes into effect from 1st of January of this year. Payment under protest is an option available to you. When you get a notice, you think that you want to respond, you respond to it, but you want to safeguard the further interest liability, you want to safeguard the penalty. So for that reason, you may consider paying that amount under protest. Ultimately, you lodge a protest, you pay that amount through DRC 03, clearly mention in that challan that this is a payment under protest against that particular notice or against that particular issue. You invite the show cause notice by writing a letter to the department that what I have paid is only under protest. I am not agreeing to that liability. So kindly issue the show cause notice if you are not agreeing to my contention, or alternately, if you are agreeing to my contention, kindly refund me the amount that I had paid under protest. So that kind of elaborate letter citing out the grounds must be also submitted to the department along with the payment under protest. And based on that, you can certainly keep your right to receive the refund alive if that issue finally gets settled in your favor. This is again a situation, I'm talking about a remedy in a situation where you are not sure, you want to avoid further exposure of interest or penalty. This is again an option that is available for you. Now, this is a checklist. So this is some very important aspect that one has to keep in mind when you receive a notice. Once you receive a notice, please first and foremost see which are the provisions of law under which it has been issued. The notice will categorically refer to those provisions. What we discussed are, we have already discussed all those provisions. Why I am saying that? Because once you see that provision, then you see whether the content of that notice is really permissible under law for which that particular notice has been issued. Because if the provision deals with written scrutiny, but if the notice is issued on altogether some other dispute or some other issue, certainly there is a mismatch, and that has to be there captured in your reply. Now, so the second question is whether the concerned provisions of law cover the situation in question. If not, you have to clearly bring that fact out in your response. Whether notice has been issued in the prescribed form. It may happen that you may find that notice has not been issued in a prescribed form. Challenge that in your reply. Whether notice has been issued in a prescribed manner. You may find that law mandates a certain notice to be issued in a certain manner. The authority has not fulfill that responsibility. Bring that out in your reply. Whether notice contains all the details that are ordinarily prerequisite for the situation in question. If the notice itself is missing certain vital details, you cannot be expected to reply to those notice. Bring that fact out when you file a response. Then think about jurisdiction. Whether the officer who has issued the notice, does he have the jurisdiction over you, either territorial, functional, or center state, what we discussed earlier. If not, challenge that in your reply. Whether the notice is adhering to principles of natural justice. Notice has to give you enough time for you to assimilate the data, assimilate the information to file a proper reply. If the notice is saying that you reply within 3 days, is it a valid notice? It is not a valid notice. You have to bring that out in your response while taking an additional time, that this is not in accordance with the principles of natural justice. In fact, at many places, like for example, section 61, the law mandates 30 days minimum time is to be given to the taxpayer to reply to the notice. So if the 30 days time is not given, you can refer to that provision and say that when the law mandates this much time is to be given, then how my reply was expected within 3 days or 7 days. So again, this is something that has to be there in your response. If the notice is relying on certain facts, like one of the queries asked me that if the notice is taking some figure based on 8A of GSTR 9 and asking me to justify that figure. Now that information, the transaction level information, is not attached with that notice. The notice is simply quoting one figure for the entire year and asking me to justify my credit claim vis-a-vis that figure. Now, humanly it is not possible to justify unless I am made available with the transaction level data of that figure. So again, this is something that should be there in your response. So what are the do's and don'ts? This is the final 2 slides. This is the heart of the topic, that whatever we discussed was necessary, because unless you don't have that knowledge, you will not be able to really respond well. So do's are, you have to maintain transaction level documents, you have to maintain all the records and registers, you have to do regular reconciliations, because as we discussed, now we are entering into an era where a lot of disputes would get created based on mere mismatches due to reconciliation. So you should be doing regular reconciliations to justify the differences. Whatever tax positions you have taken, you should be conscious about it. It should not happen that by default certain tax positions have been taken, which ultimately when it is when justification is asked from you by the department by initiating the proceedings that we discussed, you then become helpless. So that should not be the case. You should carry out regular filings, whatever is expected from you, either monthly filings or quarterly filings, half yearly filings or yearly filings. Because once you carry out self-assessment, then as we discussed, the onus is on the department really to really come back and with some concrete findings if they want to recover any additional liability from you. Get some internal, external validations, because data that you might be getting from your system, it may not be foolproof. Better before filing, because a self-assessment regime is cruel in a sense that if you file wrong data, then it is your responsibility then, because the government gave you an option to file the return based on actual liability. A trust was posed on you. So if that trust is not repaid back by way of misfiling or wrong filing, certainly the consequences can follow. You see the checklist, what we discussed in the earlier slide. Whenever you want to frame the response, whenever you respond to a notice, please be very clear. There are two major grounds that you are going to take. One are the factual grounds. Whenever you are taking a factual ground, whenever you are saying in a reply that my fact is so and so, my credit is eligible because of so and so fact, kindly support that fact with evidence. Evidence could be in the form of data or documents. Whenever you are taking a legal ground, if you are saying that you do not have a jurisdiction to issue notice, support that legal ground with the consent provision. Like if functional jurisdiction you are challenging, refer to that circular 3 by 2017. Bring out this fact that officer of your rank does not have the jurisdiction over this provision under which you are issuing the notice. Bring out the notification in respect of territorial jurisdiction. Bring out that relevant law, and if there is a case law available on that, bring that out as part of your response. And at the end of day, framing a response is an art of wisdom. It is not a mere science. You have to decide. In your toolkit you have many ammunitions. You can fire all the ammunitions at once, if you wish so, or you can keep certain ammunitions reserved based on the context, based on how the case develops. You can then decide which ammunition you want to use and in what manner. Only wisdom can suggest, and actually the response from those sitting on the other side of the table, how they are viewing your response, based on that you can tailor make your reply. But this is something again that has to be kept in mind. What are the don'ts? Don'ts are very simple. Don't overlook the law. Don't overlook the facts. Don't overlook the contents of the notice. Many times I have seen people immediately on receiving the notice start drafting the reply before even giving 5 minutes to think as to under which provision notice has been issued, whether that notice is valid, whether it has proper, whether the officer has jurisdiction. All those aspects are ignored. Simply one starts preparing reply to that notice. Don't do that. See what exactly the department is asking from you. Only give what is asked. If department is asking A, don't give them A, B and C. Give them A only. Why to give them B and C when they have not asked for B and C? There are no extra marks given in this exam. You have to stick to what is asked and you have to reply accordingly. And last don't is, don't think. Don't give reply without thinking. Please apply your mind and then frame the reply. There is no hurry. As we discussed, you can take time. Law also has given ample time for you to respond. Take your time. Be thorough in your reply, because as I discussed earlier, there are many objections that you can take only at first stage. If you don't take those objections at the first stage, taking those very objections at a later stage in the proceeding, either at the appellate stage or at a higher stage, those objections may not be considered favorably, and that is the reason why take enough time, because what I have seen that any proceeding, ultimately what you give at the ground level, how you handle it at the ground level determines the ultimate eventual outcome of that case. If you have applied your mind, if you think through at the ground level while initially responding to that notice, when that matter culminates into an order and goes into appeal, the higher authorities are going to look at the entire history of that particular proceeding, and if they find that you have been earnest enough, you have thoroughly done your homework and you have responded accordingly, there is a very bright chance that the outcome will not be negative. So that is the reason why it's very important. So these are the golden rules. You have to understand the facts, you have to understand the law, you have to derive the issues first based on the reading of the notice and the facts, apply the law to those facts. Either you can take recourse to the principles of statutory interpretation if it's a legal issue, or evidence law if it's a factual issue. You look for any binding judgments to support your stand, and always keep a keen eye on justice. Whenever you bring the justice element in your reply, I see there's a very high chance that those issues stand resolved favorably in your favor. Certainly, if it's a fraud, It's an established fraud. All this thing last 1.5 hours will not help, because if it's an established fraud, then only God save that taxpayer. So with that I end. If there are any issues, certainly I can take it up.
Thank you, Abed. There are a couple of questions in the chat window. Happy to read it out, or probably you can see it too, I guess.
Yes, I can see it now. Law permits records verify including forms out. So law permits both. You can submit the records even in electronic form, and department can verify. There is no mandatory requirement that you have to always give hard copies to the department for their verification. When the law says that you can maintain the records electronically, certainly based on that provision, you can say that since we are maintaining electronically, we are going to submit that electronically. Audit
So
should be 3 months.
section 65, the one before.
Yeah, 65, 3 months. See, 3 months time limit for completing the audit is from the date on which you give your response against the first ADT1 notice that you received. So let us say today you receive a notice asking you certain 10 things are asked from you. It may contain financial data, financial statements, certain registers, certain claims that you would have made in the returns, information regarding those claims. So those 10 things are asked from you. Let us say 15 days later, you reply giving all those 10 information that was asked from you. It is from that date that 3 months time period will start, within which then the department has to complete their audit. So that is how the 3-month calculation will happen. So 65 notice issued on the authorizing email ID, which is not a registered email ID. See the law requires that even serving the notice through an email ID is a valid means of serving the notice, except what we discussed 73 or 74, where a show cause notice cannot be served through an email ID. It requires a mandatory service through the GSTN portal. So it's a 65 notice, audit notice, general power to serve the notice can be exercised, but it has to be a registered email ID. You cannot serve it on the email ID of a authorized signatory, because authorized signatory email ID is only for the purpose of authorizing him for doing the monthly filings. It is not a blanket authority to represent the assessee for all the matters. So in that case, the proper manner of serving the notice should be on the registered email ID of that particular taxpayer and not the email ID of the authorized signatory. Under section 61, whether you alone issue notice or any other department. So that's, I think I already addressed the jurisdiction issue. 61, I am of the clear view that only your jurisdictional officer can issue the notice. No other officer is empowered under section 61 to issue you the notice. I think 8 we have already discussed. I think with that, let me see if there are additional questions. How the revenue sharing will take place after 5 years? See, that's a mystery. Right now states have already started asking questions on how the GST revenue share will happen once this 5-year window ends. That will end now in 2022. I don't have the answer. It's a political question, so probably politicians are in the best position to really answer that. There was a difference in ITC as per 2A. See, in my opinion, your claim of input tax credit cannot be determined based on 2A. This is the position in law till 31st of December of 2021. It is only from 1st January 2022 that now the law stands amended by saying under section 16(2) that there is an additional condition to test the eligibility of the credit, in terms of saying that the vendor should have uploaded the details of those invoices or debit notes, and those details should have been communicated to you. So before 1st January 22, I am of the view that 2A cannot be the basis to determine your eligibility or ineligibility, and therefore if based on 2A itself, if the department is asking you to repay the ITC, I think that is flawed, that is not correct. You should certainly you can certainly contest those demands. Regarding section 65, what is the maximum extension department can take? So maximum is, as I discussed, 6 months. 3 months is the general time limit. 6 months is the 3 plus 3. So eventually it is within the total period of 6 months that they have to complete the audit. But again, please remember, 6 months can be taken only if they have recorded the reasons in writing, taking the permission of the additional or the joint commissioner. Only in that situation that extended period will apply. Otherwise, the normal period of 3 months will apply. Is it mandatory for excise audit after GST audit complete? So excise and GST are completely independent. Both are operating in a separate domain. GST audits under section 65 are governed by the provisions of GST Act. Excise audits are governed by the provisions of the erstwhile excise law. So those have been saved by virtue of section 174 of the CGST Act. So there is a possibility that excise audit may happen. But again, in excise also, please understand there are similar time limits for issuing the show cause notice. So that virtually time limits are over for 16-17. So even if right now the audits are undertaken, there is a very less possibility that those demands might sustain. If nil demand concluded audit conducted, will they issue no due certificate for the? So there is no concept of no due certificate, but you can certainly seek the audit report, which will clearly bring out that there are no adverse findings, so that can be considered in a way as a basis, but they will not issue a no due certificate, a blanket no due certificate, but they will certainly issue a report saying that they had nil observations during that audit. So that kind of certificate you can get, right to get. No due certificate is not there in law. So I think that probably ends the questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Abhay. This was very, very informative and very engaging. Really appreciate you taking time out. Before I let go of you, I have a question myself, which we keep getting time and again in our discussions, is the requirement to submit a state-wise profit and loss account, which is a common request. And most companies, especially companies with presence in multi-state, do not have an ability, or the ERP systems do not support generating this profit and loss account. And more or less, GST is a payment basis ledger, because
absolutely.
Input credit, we don't do claim input credits on provisions. So with
Correct.
this disparity between accounting and the requirement to prepare a profit and loss account, what would be your advice on this? How do we tackle this?
See, we have also routinely come across this issue. We always tell to the department that, sir, kindly show us in the entire CGST Act or the rules from where you are coming out with a view saying that you have to give a state-wise P&L account. If you see section 35, if you go back to my slides, if you see section 35 or rule 56, nowhere there is a requirement of preparing or furnishing a state-wise P&L account. In fact, even when GST audits were to be made and 9C were to be certified by a professional, even in that context, the requirement was to furnish an audited entity level P&L, never a state level P&L. So this request is totally beyond law. And I totally agree. In P&L, when you want to look at a P&L, there are so many expenses which cannot be bifurcated across states, because GST is a transaction based levy. And when you look at a P&L, it's totally the concept of accrual accounting. So it's a totally divergent concept. Nowhere there is a requirement. So at the best, you can give the submission and you can say that as per law, there is no mandate. And whatever trial balance or whatever basis that you would have used in getting those figures, that can be produced at the best. Beyond that, it cannot be produced.
Great. Thank you, Abhay. This is very useful. Before we wind up, over to you, Purushottam. Purushottam, you there? Yeah. We have a small thank you video. We're going to play it. Thank you so much, Abhay.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you all the participants for taking time out, and thank you very much, Abhay, for sharing your knowledge and experience. Thanks all. We'll see you
Thanks. It
again
was a
in the next
pleasure.
session, which is scheduled on the 9th of January.